Welcome to this reader's guide focusing on The Left Hand of Darkness. This is a wonderful, wonderful book, but I know a lot of people have a little bit of a struggle getting into it, and so that's the purpose of this video, is to help you get over the struggle. I'm aware of what the most difficult things are getting into it, and I want to help you see the value. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful novel, one of the greatest science fiction books ever written by one of my very favorite authors, Ursula K. Guin. So I'm going to get right into it. The book was published, Left Hand of Darkness, in 1969. So there's not really any way to understand the novel that's independent of that year, 1969, which is one of the most tumultuous, crazy, dangerous, exciting, full of change and hope and disappointment and despair. It was a very dynamic time in U.S. history, and she is very much a product of that time. So a couple of things that happened in 1968, 1969. 1968 was the assassination of Martin Luther King, and the struggle, strife, pain, suffering, protest movements, some of them violent. In the aftermath of that horrific assassination, that's in the book. That kind of spirit, that kind of feeling, that kind of despair and energy about social structures. We also have 1969 was the year of the largest military protest of military action in the United States. So this was the height of the Vietnam protest movement. So a lot of people in the streets in 1969. In 1969, we also had the moon landing. Space race. But also, when you think of the moon landing, we can't think of the moon landing without also thinking about the Cold War, which was very, very, very real and very much in the face of people. And then finally in 1969, and perhaps most important for this novel, we have what is known as the Stonewall riots. Some people call it the riots, some people call it the rebellion. The Stonewall riots / rebellion were a group of gay Americans living in New York City who decided that they were no longer going to allow police officers to come into their establishments where they were gathering peacefully and beat them up and arrest them. And so this was when the struggle for gay rights, a lot of people think this is where it was born. I think it was born probably long before this, but this is when it became very public and very open. And so we have all of these different things happening. And in 1969, The Left Hand of Darkness was published, and it really handled all these different things, or examined these different things through the lens of literature and science fiction very powerfully. So let me read a little excerpt here, which is a poem, and that's very important in reading. So now I'm thinking about, so if you want to gain an understanding of this tumultuous time period, The Left Hand of Darkness is a great lens to use. We also have, in this little example, which I will read aloud, I'll try to read it with my best reading voice. Light is the left hand of darkness, and darkness the right hand of light. Two are one, life and death, lying together like lovers in Kemmer, like hands joined together, like the end and the way. And so here I'm going to talk about 4 characteristic aspects of Ursula K. Le Guin's writing style that could be, they could be challenging. So one of them is very lyrical prose. Lyrical prose is just a way that I think that you can say that now this is a poem that's embedded in the novel, and if you make it to, I think it's around, maybe chapter 12 or 13, I can't remember exactly, you'll encounter this poem. It is very important because here is the title of the book in the poem. But her lyrical prose means that her prose at times reads like poetry. And let me talk about another aspect. Here's something that's very confusing to you if you have never read the novel before. You have never heard of Kemmer. That's because she invented it. So another thing that she does in her writing is that she writes of alien cultures from the perspective of a cultural anthropologist. It's probably because her father was a professor, was a cultural anthropologist, and she grew up in a household that was steeped in interest in ancient civilizations and their cultural practices and their ways of being and their, their modes of living. And so into this poem, we have this phrase "in Kemmer," which you don't know what it means if you haven't read the book. But it's just put in there, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge to you because she'll do that very early on in the novel. Just imagine if you have never heard of Egyptian civilization before, and all of a sudden you start reading a chapter that investigates the embalming practices of how they created mummies and why all those things happened. But it was written from a perspective like you already knew something about it. She does that when she's examining these alien civilizations, which she does in great detail. And one of the great wonders of her writing is that it feels like they're real. It feels like, that there's an entire encyclopedia written about the cultural practices of, for example, the people of Karhide, but you only, open to a random page and start reading. And so it feels that way. So you just have to overcome your discomfort as you read that. Another thing she has, and I'll just underline this word darkness here, because she uses words like darkness and light in a kind of a powerful poetic sense, but also a specific sense that comes from Jungian archetypes. Carl Jung was a student of Sigmund Freud, and he developed on Freud's ideas an idea of these archetypes. They're very powerful, primal forces that exist in our lives, both inside and outside of books. So it's really fascinating if you want to get into reading Carl Jung. I'm not saying that it's all true, but I will say that it's all very, very interesting. So the idea that every person has within them something that animates their energy, like energy sources, but there's also a shadow that can play tricks on you. And then the other thing that we have is this great balance we have here in this poem. The end and the way. You can't see a phrase like the way without an awareness that that's really comes from Taoism, which is spelled with the T, crazy enough. Which the symbol, and this is interesting. I didn't realize this until I drew this symbol. Here's the symbol for Taoism, which is balance, but in the drawing of the symbol, light is the left hand of darkness. So here's the dark on the right. Light is the left hand of darkness. And you can learn more about Taoism. It's a very interesting thing. So I'm going to move on now to talk about what's probably the single most difficult thing. And she even gets to this in the first chapter. In the first chapter, she lets you know that, she doesn't let you know. The narrator, the primary narrator, whose name is Genthenian, he lets you know that this novel is going to have multiple narrators. And the novel's not going to pretend like it's a novel. The novel is going to pretend like it's an official report that has all these multiple perspectives on a very exciting event in intergalactic history. So multiple narrators. And now I'm going to list them here. I'm going to go through. I'm going to first. So it's almost every other chapter is narrated directly by Genthenian. So I'm going to write in the Genli chapters. Just going to write in Genli. Chapter 3 is a Genthenian chapter. So you might want to copy this list out and have it handy with you. There's also like some of the chapters it's clear that a narrator has switched. Some of them you have to infer based on, like, chapter 8 is a Genli. You have to infer based on who the pronouns seem to be indicating. 10 is a Genli. Going on down the line. 10 is Genli. 13 is Genli. And then 15 is Genli. And then 18, 19, and 20 are all Genli. Genli I, all the way to the end of the novel. The other most important narrator, his name is Estraven. And we see Estraven for the first time in chapter 6. He does 11. He does 14. He does 16. And that's it. And then the remaining chapters are, I'm just going to kind of, I don't know, I'm just going to put like, I don't know, I'm going to put a symbol for him actually. I don't know. I'm just going to put a big square because they're narrated by sometimes the same, sometimes it's, this is where this anthropology gets into play. So I'll just circle this like that and then point to like chapter 2, chapter 4. Maybe that's helpful. So each one of these chapters lays in a piece of sometimes ancient history, sometimes audio recordings of like folklore. It really depends on the chapter. Sometimes they were, sometimes the recordings were made by Genli I, but it's someone else's words, and that's where we get into the deep history. I'm going to move my paper up a little bit, and I can probably talk about a couple things at once. So, moving right up here, we also notice I've got these sectioned off, chapters 1 through 5, 6 through 12, 13 through 20. That's because there's big location switches, and there's also switches kind of like in the narrative energy and what's going on. So let me just let you know that chapter 1 through 5 takes place in a place called Karhide. Now, Karhide is a monarchy. I'll give you more details on Karhide. But this is where the novel opens at a parade in Karhide, and Genli I is visiting that parade as kind of an honored guest. Genli I is also known as the envoy. So there's another thing that's tricky is a lot of things have multiple names. So Genli I is his name, but he's also known as the envoy. And he's also known as the first mobile, because he is an alien on the planet that he's on, which I'll draw a picture of the planet later. So you've got that to look forward to if you're still sticking with me here. I hope you love this book. I mean, that's why I'm doing it this way. Instead of like, I hope that rather than going to a Spark Notes or something where you don't get the experience, I want you to have the experience of reading the novel. I just want to help you get into that experience a little bit so that you can negotiate it for yourself, because it's really tremendous. So we have chapters 1 through 5 in Karhide. Then we're going to switch on over to Orgoren, which that's how I pronounce it. I hope it's right. And then the final chapters are really like this adventure / quest that travels all over the world. Yeah. So now I'm going to do a little bit on the planets that are engaged, because this is an intergalactic story, you know. So I find it very helpful to just draw some planets. So I'm going to start with a planet, and I'm going to start with a set of planets over here. Got a planet right there. And then we got a planet that I'm going to draw up here. Like, this is kind of far away. And I like to make this planet up here blue, a light blue, because this planet is Gethen. And this is where our story takes place, on the planet Gethen. Also known, because everything in this book seems to have a couple of different names, Gethen. It's also known as winter. And I always like to draw this little picture right here. This kind of helps the novel come alive for whatever reason. Is here we have Genli I. And he is alone. He's not alone on the planet. He is alone as his biological setup. He is a human male. Everybody else on Gethen is the Genthenians. They're called. They have got a completely different biology that is, you could say it's androgynous. You could say it is hermaphroditic. You could say that they are genderless, but really what they are is for about 24 days a month, they are genderless. They are androgynous. They have no gender. And then about 3 or 4 days a month, they go into a different mode, which is called Kemer. That is their reproductive phase. During that time, depending on who is around and what sexual characteristics the person that they are around manifest, they will manifest the opposite. And then they will become sexually viable, and that is when all of their children are conceived. And then, like, so for example, if an androgynous alien goes into Kemer as a woman, is impregnated, then that androgynous alien, Genthenian, will stay female throughout the pregnancy, have the child, I think be able to provide the child with food as a female, and then once the child is weaned, will revert to that androgynous state for most of the time. So that's a little bit about the biology. And so over here, we have a planet called Olul. Isn't it fun? I love to draw planets. It's great. Look at this, all this space. And we have on Olul, we have what's called the stabile. The stabile of the ecumen, which I try to get here, A-K-U-M-E-N. It's an important word, so I feel a little bit bad for scrunching it, but I'm going to make up for it by highlighting it. So the ecumen is kind of the driving force behind this entire novel, because the ecumen is the reason that Genli is on Gethen Winter. The ecumen, now I have to draw some more planets. I'm going to draw little planets around Olul. Olul is not the, it's not like the capital of the ecumen. So the ecumen is an intergalactic, not an empire. It is very much not an empire. It is more like a, it's more like a United Nations type organization that is based on cooperation, sharing technology, things like that. So I've got a bunch of planets here. And there's actually like 80 planets in the ecumen. And the big deal is that according to some earlier surveys, so some of these chapters over here that are these cultural anthropology chapters, some of those chapters are the work of the investigators who came before Genli, maybe like 40 years in the past, in the time stream of the novel. So that, and they were basically doing research. They discovered that that Gethen, the civilization on Gethen, might be ready to join the ecumen. So the ecumen is really an answer to a question, and I want to get back to all these things up here. Remember, this is our world, 1969. Why would she create a concept like the ecumen in 1969? Well, it's really like what I feel is the essential question of the novel, which I'm going to write right here. And it's kind of like this. What is the relationship between? What is the relationship between? I have enough space here? Yeah, I do. Between, politics. So there's a lot of politics in this book. Government. Power. Gender. What's the relationship between all those concepts? And then it does one step further, and it imagine a reality where the relationship not about control / suppression / violence. And that is the ecumen? To me, that's the essential question of this book, or the essential, like, this is why the book exists, to examine this possibility. And I'm going to point this way, because we're going to go here next and talk about different subjects and themes. So her response in 1968, as she was working on building the novel, was to start to imagine this, because it's pretty clear that with all of these things, like this whole government, politics, power, gender is in there because of Stonewall, but also because she's a woman. Ursula K. Guin's a woman, and she's thinking about this world that she lives in, and I think this all became kind of, she built a novel. She built another universe out of this question. And this is the other thing that's true about Ursula K. Le Guin. So it's science fiction. A lot of people think science fiction is kind of like superficial. They're like, oh, well, it's just like, well, it's star blasters and like, gamma rays, whatever. But that's not how Ursula K. Le Guin sees it. So if you're not ready to get pretty deep into some pretty serious concepts, Ursula K. Le Guin is going to be pretty tough for you. So, Olul is 17 light years away, which means, it's hard to travel there, 17 light years. But in this universe, there's a direct communication that's called Ansible, which is instantaneous communication. I'll just say instant because it's easier. Instant comms. So we have two different places. Now I'm going to speed up a little bit. So right here I said Karhide. Boop, 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 boop. What's Karhide like? Well, Karhide is, it's a monarchy. And that's where Estraven is like a prime minister. He's an important part of the government there. The king, his name is Argavan. And this Karhide has like distinct cultural practices that are unique. Think about how different, rural China is to like, Chicago in the United States. Like how different the cultural practices are. Different languages, different religious viewpoints. Like it's just a very, very different world. That's what she does in the construction of Karhide. And then there's also a dude over here named Tybe. Then the envoy travels. So it's always the envoy who's traveling. We're following him to a different place called Orgoren. Orgoren. And in Orgoren, it's a totally different environment, different government, different system of government. It's a bureaucracy. It's kind of like communist. So now we're going back to the Cold War. It's kind of like communist Soviet Union in the 1960s. Bureaucracy, very much like communism. There are competing factions. Instead of like one king who with all the power, there are competing power centers, competing factions. And then there's also like a powerful secret police. And there's also like work camps, like a gulag. We call that. So that's what's going on over there. So now the final thing, I think this is everything that I had over here. Now the final thing is subject and themes. Remember, subjects are just like the different aspects of life that the novel looks at. The theme, this is your interpretation of, well, what is the author trying to say about those subjects? So, for example, very clearly in the novel, we have, and I'll just list them out, we've got war, we've got history, we've got culture, we've got gender, we've got politics, we've got truth, we've got progress, and this is like civilization, progress of civilization, we've got friendship, we've got gender and power. We have gender and war. So these are like questions. Like, is war a gendered concept? And we have sex and culture. because this alien civilization has got very different practices that are organized around sex. And so how does that impact culture? What do those things have to do? So for each one of these, you come up with a little statement of like, well, what is it that Ursula K. Le Guin wants us to learn, wants us to gain in our knowledge of friendship, progress, truth? And then those are all the themes, but that's really your job as an interpreter of literature to come up with those. So I'm going to leave this as a big space with maybe some really artful question marks. And that's it. That is it for this video. Questions. Read the novel. Love it. Hope you do. I definitely do.